Hi, David. I just wanted to
Hi.
talk with you about some of the content from the course that I could share with my online only students for this week, so they can have a little bit more of an interaction experience with their fellow students. So this week is relativism and divine command theory. So the relativism reading, just to say, one of the reasons I leave it to the end of the semester, which is where we're kind of at, is I want students to learn about utilitarianism, learn about Kantian ethics, learn about virtue ethics, try to apply them, try to sort out these issues about the gamer's dilemma, about abortion, about famine relief, and argue over answers and come to, views which they feel are justified by arguments. And then we bring in relativism that comes in and says, there aren't really arguments backing these things up. They're just cultural traditions. Some cultures are different. You should just go play along with whatever your society says. I want to introduce relativism once we have already not done that, once we've already kind of treated ethics in this sort of absolutist way that's backed by arguments rather than mere tradition. And I was wondering, when you came into this course, were you expecting it to be, just relativistic and talking about different cultures? I'm curious, I'll shut up now.
Well, in the relativism reading, it says that many people start out absolutist and then they move to naive relativistic. And I mean I wasn't I thought that 2 + 2 = 4 was absolute, or at least sort of. I mean, maybe we'll talk about that later, but
Okay.
anyway, because obviously that depends on the
Yeah.
But anyway, I felt pretty strongly relativistic, morally relativistic. But that didn't mean that, I don't know. I mean, I tried to say that it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that slavery is right if the culture says it is. It's well, it's like that I can't ultimately back up what I'm saying, and I just have a set of values which is arbitrary or somewhat arbitrary, and then I have to apply them. And so I can say slavery is wrong, but ultimately I have to accept that it relies on these values which are just for me. But I did in how the reading said something about what was it, sort of how we can go to somewhere where slavery is practiced, and we can say, well, if they think that the sun is not the center of the earth, you can give them arguments for that, whatever. You can try to convince them of it. And you could do the same thing with slavery. You could say, we have these arguments why slavery is wrong. And so that, I felt that was kind of convincing. But as the course went on, definitely, I feel a little more there's definitely still some things that are relativistic. But maybe there's also some absolute moral truth as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of examples of things that people treat as moral matters, which are relativistic things, and I think really don't deserve to be called morality. Your parents will chastise you for cursing growing up, and I don't know what the argument against cursing could possibly be. Okay, so let's talk about divine command theory. So this goes back to a famous work of Plato. I mean, you might not be. I think you're probably familiar with the whole Socrates-Plato thing. So Socrates never wrote anything down. He just went around the city having these conversations with people, and Plato and other people might write down the discussions that Socrates had. And so one of the conversations Socrates had is with a Greek named Euthyphro, and they're debating in that, is something good because God made it good, or does God like it because it is good, prior, right? So is something, another way to put it, is something wrong because God said it's wrong, or did God tell us it's wrong because it is wrong independently? And this week's readings, I tried to sort of push what I think most philosophers take to be the right answer here, is that things are wrong God doesn't make them wrong by saying they're wrong. They're just wrong. I mean, and if God's perfect, then he'll help us get knowledge about what's wrong. There's a worry I think a lot of people have about that, if you're religious, is that that's limiting of God's power, because now it seems like God's not creating everything. I think a couple things to say about that. You could still say God, if you take the moral theories we looked at, right, God still would have created happiness and suffering. So in some sense, he would have created good and bad. he couldn't make suffering good and happiness bad, right? That so there's a limit there, but and you know, the other thing you could say if you're a Kantian, like God created free will and stuff like that. But when I say he can't make suffering a good thing, it doesn't. I think the response there is that that's like asking God to make a stone so heavy he can't lift it, or saying, "Hey God, can you make me a blarg schlarg nargety larg?" And God can't make me a blarg schlarg nargety larg because that's meaningless. I said, God, can you make? And then I uttered nonsense. Like there's nothing in my head. I just said, tongue, start uttering random noises, and those are the noises that came out. So if it's a pseudo question, a pseudo task, not something that even makes any coherent sense, it doesn't seem like a limitation or a failure on a God to not be able to do it. I keep using not be able as if because that sounds like limiting, but it's not there. It's not a task that exists to be done. But anyway, what are your thoughts on divine command theory?
Yeah, well, I mean, when I was 13, like I definitely was like, God can't exist because omnipotence means you can perform any action, and any action means you can create a stone so heavy you can't lift it. But I do think actually it does really make sense that, I mean, like omnipotence doesn't really mean you can perform any action. It means you can perform any action that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I know I felt like, yeah, there wasn't really any reading like supporting divine command theory. But I mean, if like basically everybody doesn't like it, then I can kind of see why.
It's a very small in normal life, right? If you go around and ask people on the street, does God make commands and then just turn things good or bad? You're going to get a huge number of people saying yes. If you ask that same question of philosophers, there's not many. People were like, this is one of those issues that feels settled, right? It was probably like as soon as Socrates had this conversation about it, they ended up, the sort of push of that conversation was that divine command theory is wrong and that things are good or bad, and then God loves them because they're good and bad. He doesn't make them good or bad. It seems like philosophers have just always like 90% been, divine command theory is hopeless. There are some philosophers who try to make it work, for any position, whether it's in the sciences or philosophy, there's always somebody in the field who's trying to still save it. So this is, I feel like, one of those ones that there's not a lot of support for. It's interesting though, because it's one of those ones that's so common in ordinary life and in ordinary people's thinking. I think, I mean, what utilitarians will say, yeah, God created morality in the sense that he created happiness and he created suffering. And if you're a Kantian, you can say he created, he arranged the world such that, the things that are necessary for morality exist, but he can't switch that. He can't make rape good by commanding us to do that. Right.
Yeah.
And why can't he do that? I think it's like drawing a circle square. If I say, go to the board, draw me one shape that is both a square and a circle. Like, you can't do it. It's not because it's not like the chalk is too heavy or somebody's coming up and knocking the chalk out of your hand every time you try to draw a circle square. It's like, there's no such shape for me to draw. Like that doesn't exist. And I think you could complain that when I say, go up to the board and draw a circle square, I've said, go up to the board, draw A. And then I said things that don't cohere in any way that produce a request, that produce something to be drawn. I mean, the other thing I don't know if I find this response pretty convincing, the stuff about how it's not a limitation on God. I mean, the other thing you could say is like, well, God just can't exist, or gods are limited, or God, you could just accept the fact, or you could just not believe in God. But I think that there's no reason why a religious person has to accept divine command theory. They can be a utilitarian, they can be a Kantian, they can be a virtue ethicist. I mean, I think of virtue ethics, theistic virtue ethics. You can just be like, well, God created Jesus to show us what the perfect human is like. It's very easy to give religious versions of these moral theories.
Yeah. I saw a because I don't know much about Christianity. I don't know much about it. So I watched some video of some guy like at a Christian university talking about the three ethical theories. And it was really funny because he brought up utilitarianism just to like knock it down instantly, saying, I don't remember. And then same with Kantian ethics. And then with, because he was like, where does God get to be involved? And then with virtue ethics, he's like, now I can, put like God as one of my virtues or whatever. And so that's kind of an interesting, like God is sort of makes things ethical, but like not all the way.
I mean, in what Kant thought was like God made us in his image, in that he gave us the ability to control ourselves and act according to reason. And so we're most like God when we resist temptation and act according to reason, which is acting morally. And like, it's not that God has two gangly arms, and so he made humans with two gangly arms. Is that he gave us this free will and the ability to act from reason, and Kant thinks act morally, and that's when you become closest. So like that, I didn't, obviously I haven't seen the video that you watched of this Christian professor talking about these three theories. I think it's a little short-sighted of him not to realize that there are, Christian, or not just Christian, but like religious versions of these moral theories that are pretty easy to make.
I think that the two, because you're talking about the argument that, like you can't ask God to do a pseudo task. I find that very convincing. And then I think the other big one was like, essentially, like, X, let's say that you take some really bad action like murder or rape.
Yeah.
And then you say, by divine command theory says, God says so, and so that could be right if God wanted it to be so. I don't find that argument too convincing, I have to say, because like if God said it was so, then it wouldn't be immoral. And if God does say it's so, then it can be whatever God wants it to be in that case. And so I mean, like, let's say what this action is really bad. Well, then God said it's moral because God chose that it was. And so I don't find that one convincing, but I do find the one, well, you don't really need it. I find that one very convincing, and it doesn't make sense.
Let's pretend that utilitarianism is true for a second. So happiness, like is good and suffering is bad. And the idea that I think the utilitarian would have to push is that, happiness can't be bad, just like a circle can't be a square, right? Like they're so intimately connected. If utilitarianism is right, they're so intimately connected that there's just no possible world where happiness turns out to be bad. So it's true in all. It's similar to a math problem. Like once you know the answer, you know how it's true in all possible worlds. Before it could be one or the other, but as soon as you realize it's correct, you realize, oh, it has to be correct everywhere. If that's the case, then I don't see how God couldn't. Let's just take an act. He said, go do this action. It's going to produce terrible. I mean, if he tells me to do something that looks like it's going to cause a lot of suffering, I might think, well, he knows something I don't know, right?
Yeah.
I don't think it's, well, he doesn't know something I don't know. He just literally made something that causes more suffering than happiness good. That's the thing that I think the utilitarian wants to say he can't, that can't, maybe not that he can't do, but can't happen. Right? Let's not put the limitation on him or her.
No, I agree with you. Like God, like if utilitarianism is correct, then like divine command theory would have to say like utilitarianism is right because God said happiness is good and suffering is bad. But God,
which would imply that he could have gone the other way.
Yeah,
and that's
what I mean is God can't then later God can't like have things that we consider bad be bad, or sorry, be good after like saying like God would only create the foundation. In that case, right? God would say suffering is bad, happiness is good, but then like God can't later command you to do something that would go against that, right?
Yeah, and there's other things to say here, like how do you tell the difference between God whispering in your ear and the devil whispering in your ear? One of the readings is by Emily Aquino. So she actually is a former student, and I was TAing for a class that she was in, and so she wrote this paper. I gave her a lot of feedback. She revised it, then she submitted it to some undergrad conference on philosophy. And so like this is like a paper that she's been kicking around editing since the time she wrote it for my class, and it's gotten better and better. So I mean I think it's a nice paper. It's worth reading. But she talks a lot about in that paper about this idea that God gives you, he tells you not to murder doesn't explain, well, does that rule out abortion or not? Does that what happens in cases where you can push the fat man from the bridge to save 5 lives? Can I withhold medicine from one so that he dies and I get his organs to say, like, you have to fill in all those details with your own the idea that I guess is that unless you have God there to like just get updated advice on all these complicated situations, it doesn't seem like divine command theory gives us enough information to be able to sort out what's right and what's wrong to do. We tend to fill in the gaps with our own moral thinking and like, all right, well, I can tell that more utilitarianism is true, so God would just command what the utilitarian says. That's why I can figure out what to do in all these contexts where I don't get explicit advice from God. I mean, plenty of people will say, well, God says this, and then you say, where? And you can open up the Bible and like it's just they use their own moral reasoning to think, okay, this is wrong, so it has to be what God would God would tell me not to. So, but they get to the fact that it's wrong through their just own moral reasoning. I mean, there's a way in which religious people are often able to break away from, like, I think there's a lot of Americans in Civil War times who came to be anti-slavery, and they were convinced that God would be against slavery. There's not a lot of evidence for that in the Bible, right? But the idea is they're like, no, I can see that this is a terrible moral wrong because of violations of free choice and the suffering and the fact that it's not treating all men as equal, right? And that's just their independent moral thinking. And then they assume that must be what God wants, to stop slavery, because they can see it's wrong itself. They don't need him to tell them. Anyway.
Well,
okay.
yeah.
Well, I've talked. Let's go ahead and end this. Do you have any final thoughts on divine command theory?
Yeah. One final thought, which is that I think like one argument you hear a lot is like people say like, well, like if we don't have a God to like command that this is right and this is wrong, then like people will just do whatever. There'll be like total anarchy. Like we need God to tell us this is bad, this is right, and then like enact divine justice, with like heaven, hell. But ultimately, like with divine command theory, like if God could command anything, then it seems like that is more arbitrary, right? Than having like some actual like moral system like Kantianism or utilitarian virtue ethics, where things would actually be like absolutely depending on which action it is, right or wrong.
Yeah, and there's a way in which I was at a bar once, and I was sitting at the bar and I'm drinking, and I can hear there's only one other group of people in the bar, and there's a woman, and she's there. I guess this girl had just gotten married, and her husband had cheated on her pretty quickly. And they're like, he promised God that he would, and they were just like, oh, on and on and on about how he violated his vows at the ceremony and disobeyed God. And I really want to turn around and be like, what about the promise to the bride? Like, why is it only the promise to that guy that matters? Like, he promised, there's a person here who actually got hurt. Like, I can understand God being mad because she got hurt, right? It's not, there's a way in which often I worry that like divine command theory just directs your attention morally to the wrong things, right? Like, it's God telling you not to do it that makes you not want to kill people. Like, no, like if God's telling you not to do it, it's because he cares about that person. And you could also just care about that person even if God wasn't there. Like, that's where the wrongness arises. Like, you don't need the third party involved. Sure, it helps if there's a all-knowing God who can like come in and help encourage you to do the right thing and give you like advice, but like, and maybe that helps you with some sort of reward in the afterlife. But like the wrongness coming from the commands as opposed to the harm being done or the person choices being violated, that seems like a moral misdirection, which is not healthy for people. Okay, well, great. Thanks for talking. We'll do this hopefully again next week and talk about, and we'll probably have Sophia with us as well.
Yeah, hopefully so.
Right,
Yeah.
thanks.
All right. Thank you.